The Apache woman who picked her cowboy, a story of courage and choice. The dust hadn't settled from the gunshot when Maria saw him fall. The cowboy with the brown hat tumbled from his horse just 20 feet from where she crouched behind the rocks. 3 riders circled him like wolves, their guns drawn and ready. She knew those men. They rode for Clayton Burke, the rancher who'd been pushing Apache families off their land for months. The cowboy on the ground was bleeding from his shoulder, crawling toward a boulder for cover. He wouldn't make it. The riders were already dismounting, taking their time because they thought they had him trapped. Maria made her choice in seconds. She raised her father's rifle and fired twice into the air. The riders spun around, confused, searching for the source. She fired again, this time hitting the dirt near their boots. They scrambled for their horses, not willing to face an unknown number of shooters in the rocks. Within moments, they were riding hard toward the valley, leaving dust and curses behind them. She waited 5 full minutes before approaching the wounded man. He was young, maybe 25, with sandy hair and eyes that watched her warily as she came closer. His hand stayed near his gun, even though his face was pale from blood loss. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said in English. "But you'll die if that wound isn't treated." "You're Apache," he said. It wasn't a question. "My name is Maria, and you're bleeding on land my people have walked for generations." She knelt beside him, examining the wound. "The bullet went through. You're lucky." "Doesn't feel lucky." He winced as she pressed cloth against the wound. "Why'd you help me?" "Because Burke's men would have killed you. Same as they've killed others." She tied the bandage tight. "What's your name?"
"Jack."
"Jack Cooper."
He studied her face.
"You just made enemies of Burke's whole crew." "They were already my enemies." Maria helped him sit up. "Can you ride?" "I think so." He looked at his horse, which had stopped 50 yards away, grazing calmly as if gunfights were ordinary afternoon events. "Where were you headed before this started?" "To warn my village. Burke's planning something." "I heard his men talking in town yesterday." She retrieved his hat and handed it to him. "They're coming tonight with fire and guns." Jack's jaw tightened. "How many in your village?" 40. Maybe half are children and elders." She met his eyes. "We have some weapons, but not enough. Not for what's coming." He was quiet for a moment, then pushed himself to his feet with a grunt of pain. "Then we'd better move fast. I know some people who might help." "Why would you help us?" Maria asked. "You don't even know us." "Because Burke killed my brother 3 months ago over a water dispute." "Because what he's doing is wrong." Jack walked unsteadily toward his horse. "And because you just saved my life when you could have let those men finish me. That means something." Maria watched him mount his horse, favoring his injured shoulder. She'd heard stories about cowboys all her life. Some were good, some were bad, most were just trying to survive like everyone else. But this one had just offered to stand against Burke, and that took more than ordinary courage. "My village is 5 miles north," she said, climbing onto her own paint horse. "If you're coming, we need to ride now." Jack nodded, turning his horse toward the mountains. "Then let's ride." As they galloped across the desert, Maria realized she'd just changed both their lives. Before today, she'd been invisible to men like Jack. Now they were allies in a fight that could get them both killed. She glanced at him riding beside her, his face set with determination despite the pain he must be feeling. She'd picked this cowboy to save, and somehow she knew the choice would echo through everything that came next. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon. They had maybe 4 hours before Burke's men would come. 4 hours to prepare, to gather weapons, to make a stand. Maria pushed her horse harder, and Jack kept pace without complaint. Behind them, the desert stretched empty and quiet. But tonight, it would run red with violence, and only the strong and the clever would see tomorrow's dawn. The village appeared ahead, a cluster of homes nestled against the red cliffs. Maria could see people moving about their evening tasks, unaware of the storm coming their way. She had to warn them, had to convince them to fight or flee. And she had this wounded cowboy beside her, a stranger who'd offered help when he could have ridden away. Her father would have questions. The elders would have doubts. But Maria had made her choice, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited them in the darkness ahead. They rode through the village entrance as the first stars appeared in the purple sky. People stopped their work to stare at the Apache woman and the bleeding cowboy riding side by side. Maria could feel their confusion, their concern, their fear. She raised her hand in greeting and called out the words that would change everything. "Burke is coming tonight. We need to prepare for war." Jack Cooper had been riding fence lines when Burke's men found him. He'd been minding his own business, checking for breaks in the wire on his small ranch. He'd inherited the land from his brother, the same brother Burke had shot for refusing to sell his water rights. Jack had promised himself he'd never let Burke take what his brother had died protecting. That promise had nearly gotten him killed an hour ago, and now here he was, riding into an Apache village with a bullet hole in his shoulder and a warning about an attack he had no business getting involved in. But Billy's face kept appearing in his mind, and he knew he couldn't ride away. Not this time. The Apache people gathered quickly when Maria called out her warning. Jack counted about 40, just as she'd said, men, women, children, elders. Families, just like any town, just like any settlement. They looked at him with suspicion and curiosity, and he couldn't blame them. A white cowboy showing up with one of their own, bleeding and talking about Burke's raid, must have seemed strange at best and like a trap at worst. An older man stepped forward. He had silver streaks in his long black hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through Jack's skull. "Maria, what is this?" "Father, this is Jack Cooper. Burke's men shot him, and I helped him. He says he knows people who might help us defend against tonight's attack." Maria dismounted and stood beside Jack's horse. "He lost his brother to Burke 3 months ago. He has reason to fight." Jack slid carefully from his saddle, trying not to show how much the movement hurt. "Sir, I know I'm not welcome here. I understand that. But Maria's right. Burke is planning something, and from what I know of that man, it's going to be bad. I have 5 friends who work ranches nearby, good men who've had their own problems with Burke. If you let me, I can ride out and bring them back before dark. That's 6 more rifles, 6 more fighters." The older man studied Jack for a long moment. "Why should we trust you? Your people have lied to us before. You shouldn't trust me. You don't know me." Jack met his gaze without flinching. "But Maria saved my life when she didn't have to. That means I owe her a debt, and I pay my debts. Beyond that, Burke killed my brother for standing up to him. If I can hurt Burke's plans even a little bit, I'm going to do it. Your fight and my fight are the same fight tonight." Maria's father glanced at his daughter, then back at Jack. "How do we know you won't lead Burke's men straight to us? Because if I wanted to do that, I wouldn't have told Maria about the attack. I would have just ridden away and let her stay ignorant." Jack took off his hat, wiping sweat and blood from his forehead. "Look, I understand you have no reason to believe me, but time's running out. Either let me help or tell me to leave. Just decide fast." The older man spoke quietly in Apache to Maria. She responded in the same language, her tone urgent and insistent. Other villagers joined the conversation, voices rising and falling in rapid debate. Jack stood silent, knowing that his fate and possibly Maria's were being decided right now. His shoulder throbbed, and he could feel blood seeping through the bandage. He needed proper medical attention, but that would have to wait. Finally, Maria's father turned back to him. "My name is Joseph. Maria is my daughter, and she has good judgment about people. She says you have honest eyes, and she's rarely wrong. You can go get your friends, but leave your gun here. If you're truly coming back to help, you won't need it for the ride. If you don't come back, we'll know you were lying." It was a test, and Jack knew it. Riding unarmed through Burke's territory would be dangerous, especially if the rancher's men were already moving into position. But refusing would prove he couldn't be trusted.
He unbuckled his gun belt and handed it to Joseph.
"Fair enough. I'll be back within 2 hours. My friends live at the Morrison place, about 8 miles east."
"They'll come. I'm going with you," Maria said suddenly.
"Maria, no," Joseph began, but she cut him off. "Father, if he doesn't come back, we need to know why. If Burke's men catch him, I can get away and warn us. If he's leading us into a trap, I can stop him before it's sprung." She grabbed fresh supplies from a nearby home and swung back onto her horse. "Besides, he's injured. He needs someone watching his back." Joseph looked like he wanted to argue, but he just sighed. "You're as stubborn as your mother was. Go, but be back before sunset, or we'll assume the worst." Jack mounted up, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Thank you. For trusting me this much, anyway." "Don't thank me yet," Joseph said. "If you're lying, if you bring trouble here, you won't leave this village alive." "Understood?" Jack turned his horse east, and Maria fell in beside him. They rode out of the village at a gallop, racing against the dying light. Once they were clear of the village, Maria spoke. "That was brave, leaving your gun behind. Stupid, maybe, but necessary." Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for riders. "Your father's right not to trust me. I wouldn't trust me either, but I trust you." Maria glanced at him. You could have stayed hidden when Burke's men were hunting you. You could have ridden away when I told you about the attack. You could have refused to help, but you didn't. That tells me what kind of man you are." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he just kept riding. The desert stretched before them, painted gold and red by the setting sun. Somewhere out there, Burke's men were gathering, preparing their weapons, planning murder. And here he was, unarmed and wounded, riding to ask his friends to risk their lives for people they'd never met. He must be crazy. Billy would have laughed at him, then immediately agreed to help. His brother had always been that way, jumping into fights for the underdog, standing up for what was right even when it cost him. Maybe that's why Jack was doing this. Maybe this was his way of honoring his brother's memory. They rode in silence for a while, both scanning the landscape for signs of danger. The sun touched the western mountains, and the shadows grew long across the sand. Time was running short. If they didn't reach Morrison's ranch soon, they'd be too late to get back before Burke attacked. Jack urged his horse faster, and Maria kept pace effortlessly. She rode like someone who'd been born on horseback, moving with the animal instead of fighting it. He found himself admiring her skill, her courage, her quick thinking back when she'd saved him. She could have let him die. Most Apache would have, given how white settlers had treated her people. But she'd made a different choice. "There," Maria pointed ahead. "Smoke from a chimney." Jack saw it too, a thin line of smoke rising from behind a ridge. Morrison's ranch. Relief flooded through him, followed quickly by anxiety. Would his friends believe him? Would they agree to help? He'd known Pete Morrison and his crew for 3 years, ever since Billy had bought the ranch. They were good men, hard workers, honest dealers. But asking them to fight Burke's outfit was asking them to risk everything. Burke had money, power, and a dozen hired guns. Going against him meant making an enemy for life, assuming you survived the first fight. They crested the ridge and saw the ranch spread below them. It was a modest operation, a small house, a barn, corrals with a few dozen cattle. 3 men stood near the barn, and they all reached for their rifles when they saw riders approaching. Jack raised his good arm high, signaling peace. "Pete, it's Jack Cooper!" One of the men lowered his rifle and stepped forward, squinting into the sunset glare. "Jack, that you? What happened to your shoulder?" They rode into the yard, and Jack dismounted carefully. Pete Morrison was a big man with a black beard and calloused hands that could gentle a horse or break a jaw with equal ease. He'd been Billy's best friend, and he'd helped Jack bury his brother. Behind him stood Danny Wright and Carlos Mendez, both young ranch hands who'd worked for the Coopers for years. "Burke's men shot me this afternoon," Jack said without preamble. She saved my life. Now I need your help saving hers and her people's lives. Burke's planning to attack her village tonight. He's coming with fire and guns, planning to drive them off their land or kill them trying. I need you to ride with me. All of you." Pete's expression darkened. "Burke, huh? That bastard's been pushing his luck for months." He looked at Maria, then back at Jack. "How many guns does Burke have?" "Usually about 12 men, maybe more for something like this." Jack held Pete's gaze. "I know what I'm asking. Billy would have gone in a heartbeat, but he's gone. I can't do this alone. Maria's people are just families trying to live their lives." "They don't deserve what's coming," Danny spoke up, his young face serious. "Burke's men killed my cousin last year in a card game they claimed was fair. Never got justice for that." Carlos nodded. "And Burke stole 3 of my father's horses and said we couldn't prove ownership. The law did nothing." Pete was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. Then he smiled grimly. "Looks like Burke's made enemies of all of us." "When do we ride?" "Now," Maria said. "We have maybe an hour and a half before they attack. Then we'd better move." Pete turned and shouted toward the house. "Frank, Luke, get out here. We're riding out." 2 more men emerged from the house, brothers by the look of them, both lean and tough as whipcord. Pete quickly explained the situation, and they didn't hesitate. Within 10 minutes, all 6 men were mounted and armed, with extra ammunition packed in their saddlebags. Jack felt something loosen in his chest. They were coming. They were actually coming. "Thank you," he said to Pete. "All of you." "Don't thank us yet," Pete replied. "Let's see if we survive the night first. Now let's ride before Burke beats us there." They rode hard back toward the Apache village, 7 riders against the approaching darkness. Jack's shoulders screamed with every jarring step his horse took, but he ignored it. Pain was temporary. What mattered was getting back before Burke arrived, getting into position, making a stand. Maria rode at the front, guiding them through shortcuts across the desert that Jack had never known existed. She knew this land like he knew his own ranch. Every rock and gully and hidden path. The sun dropped below the mountains, and twilight settled over the desert. Stars began to appear overhead, cold and distant. Jack thought about Billy, wondered if his brother was watching from somewhere beyond, wondered if he'd approve of this desperate gamble. He thought he would. Billy had always believed in fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, in standing up to bullies even when the odds were bad. This was exactly the kind of fight Billy would have chosen. They topped a rise and saw the village below, torches already lit, people moving with urgent purpose. Joseph had taken Jack's warning seriously. Barricades were being constructed, firing positions prepared. Women and children were being moved to the caves in the cliffs behind the village. The men were checking weapons and organizing defensive positions. It looked like a settlement preparing for siege. Jack and his group rode down into the village, and this time the reception was different. Maria called out in Apache, explaining who the riders were and why they'd come. Joseph stepped forward, and this time his expression held something close to respect. "You came back," he said to Jack. "And you brought help. I gave you my word." Jack dismounted, swaying slightly from blood loss and exhaustion. "My friends are good fighters. They all have reasons to hate Burke. They'll stand with you tonight." Joseph nodded, then looked at Pete and the others. "You honor us with your courage. Tonight, we fight together, white and Apache, side by side. Tomorrow, if we live, we'll remember this night as the moment we chose to stand instead of run." Pete stepped forward and offered his hand. Joseph took it, and the two men shook firmly. Around them, Apache warriors and white cowboys began introducing themselves, sharing ammunition, planning defensive strategies. It was strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Jack had never imagined he'd see Apache and white settlers working together like this, united by a common enemy and a shared determination to survive. Maria found Jack and pressed a cup of water into his hands. "Drink. Then let someone look at your wound properly." "No time," Jack said, but she glared at him. "You're no good to us if you pass out from blood loss in the middle of the fight. Drink." "Sit. 5 minutes." He couldn't argue with that logic, so he sat while an elderly Apache woman cleaned and rebandaged his shoulder with practiced efficiency. She didn't speak English, but she hummed softly while she worked, and there was something comforting about it. When she finished, she patted his cheek gently and said something in Apache. Maria translated. "She says you have a good heart but a foolish head. The combination will either get you killed or make you a legend." Maria smiled slightly. She's usually right about these things. Before Jack could respond, a shout came from the ridge above the village. A scout had spotted riders approaching from the south, at least 15 men, moving fast and carrying torches. Burke's forces were larger than expected, and they were arriving early. The attack was beginning now, with twilight barely faded and night not fully arrived. There was no more time for preparation, no more time for plans. The fight was here. Joseph's voice rang out across the village, sharp and commanding in Apache. Warriors rushed to their positions. Pete and his crew spread out along the barricades, checking their rifles and handguns. Maria grabbed her father's rifle and took position behind a wall of stacked stones. Jack checked his borrowed gun, his hand steady despite the fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. The riders came closer, their torches bobbing in the darkness like angry fireflies. Jack could hear them now, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of men working themselves up for violence. He recognized Burke's voice above the others, calling orders, promising rewards for burning the village to ash. The hatred in that voice made Jack's blood run cold. This wasn't about land or water rights anymore. This was about cruelty for its own sake, about crushing people just because you could. "Here they come," Pete muttered beside Jack. "Make every shot count." The riders charged into range, and Joseph gave the order. The night exploded with gunfire. Rifles cracked and pistols barked, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like lightning. Burke's men returned fire, bullets whining off rocks and thudding into wooden barricades. A torch sailed through the air and landed near a home, but Apache women rushed forward with water and smothered it before it could spread. Another torch followed, then another. The night filled with smoke and noise and confusion. Jack fired carefully, methodically, making each bullet count. Beside him, Pete was doing the same, his big rifle booming with authority. Danny and Carlos held the left flank, their younger reflexes giving them an edge. Maria was everywhere, moving between positions, carrying ammunition, encouraging fighters, firing her own rifle with deadly accuracy. She moved like a ghost through the chaos, fearless and focused. Burke's men pressed forward, realizing the village had more defenders than expected. They spread out, trying to find weak points in the defensive line. One rider broke through on the eastern edge and charged toward the homes where children were sheltered. Carlos saw him coming and sprinted to intercept, tackling the man off his horse and wrestling him to the ground. Frank and Luke rushed to help, and together they subdued the attacker and dragged him back behind the lines. "They're trying to flank us on the right," Pete shouted over the gunfire. "Jack, take Maria and Danny. Stop them." Jack didn't hesitate. He ran toward the right side of the village, his wounded shoulder protesting every movement. Maria and Danny followed close behind. They reached the edge of the defensive line just as 4 of Burke's men were dismounting, trying to sneak around behind the barricades. Jack dropped to one knee and fired, hitting one man in the leg. He went down screaming. Maria fired twice, and another man fell. Danny took down the third with a clean shot to the shoulder. The 4th man saw his companions fall and decided he wanted no part of this fight. He scrambled back onto his horse and galloped away into the darkness. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Burke's men made several charges, each one repelled by the combined force of Apache warriors and cowboy marksmen. Bodies lay scattered across the desert floor, both attackers and a few defenders. The air stank of gunpowder and blood and fear. Jack's ammunition was running low, and his shoulder had started bleeding again, soaking through the fresh bandage. But he kept firing, kept fighting, because there was no other choice. If they broke now, if they ran, Burke would slaughter everyone in the village. Then, suddenly, it was over. Burke's remaining men began pulling back, dragging their wounded with them. Someone shouted an order to retreat, and the attackers melted back into the darkness, leaving their torches scattered across the ground like fallen stars. The gunfire tapered off, then stopped altogether. An eerie silence settled over the village, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the crackling of dying torches. Jack stood slowly, his legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. They'd done it. They'd held the line. Burke's attack had failed. Around him, defenders were emerging from cover, checking on each other, counting their losses. Joseph walked among his people, offering words of comfort and praise. Pete and his crew gathered near the main barricade, all still standing, all still breathing. Carlos had a graze across his ribs, and Frank's hat had a bullet hole through the crown, but otherwise they'd come through intact. Maria found Jack in the darkness and touched his arm gently. "You're bleeding again, I know." He was too tired to care much. "Is everyone okay?" 3 of our warriors were wounded, none seriously. One elder had a heart problem from the stress, but she's stable now. Maria looked out at the desert where Burke's men had retreated. "We lost no one. Thanks to you and your friends, we lost no one." Jack slumped against a wall, suddenly aware of how much blood he'd lost over the past few hours. His vision was getting fuzzy around the edges, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Maria caught him as he started to slide down the wall. "Someone help me," she called out. "He needs rest and medical attention, now." The last thing Jack remembered before darkness took him was Maria's face above his, her eyes filled with concern and something else he couldn't quite name. Then the world went black, and he fell into deep, dreamless sleep. Jack woke to sunlight streaming through a window and the smell of sage smoke. His shoulder was bandaged properly now, tight and clean, and the pain had faded to a dull throb instead of the screaming agony he remembered. He was lying on a bed in a small room with adobe walls and woven blankets. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back. The battle. Burke's attack. Maria. He sat up slowly, testing his body's limits. His shoulder protested but held. Someone had stripped off his bloody shirt and replaced it with a clean one, and his gun belt hung on a peg near the door. Voices murmured outside, speaking both English and Apache in a mixture he found oddly comforting. The door opened, and Maria entered carrying a bowl of something that smelled wonderful. "You're awake. Good. You need to eat." "How long was I out?" "All night and most of the morning. It's almost noon now." She set the bowl on a table beside the bed. "It was some kind of stew with meat and vegetables. You lost a lot of blood. My grandmother said you're lucky to be alive." Jack picked up the bowl and started eating. He was hungrier than he'd realized, and the stew was delicious. "What happened after the fight? Did Burke come back?" "No. He and his remaining men rode back to his ranch. We sent scouts to watch them." Maria sat in a chair across from him. "My father spoke with the territorial marshal this morning. He rode out at dawn with 5 deputies. They're arresting Burke for attempted murder and arson right now." Jack nearly dropped his spoon. The marshal. "How did you get him here so fast?" "We didn't. He was already on his way. Apparently, several ranchers filed complaints about Burke in the past month. The marshal was investigating, waiting for enough evidence to make arrests. Maria smiled. Your friend Pete sent a rider to the marshal's office during the battle. Told him what was happening. The marshal says our testimony and the evidence from last night's attack will be enough to put Burke away for a long time. Relief washed over Jack so strongly he had to set down the bowl before he spilled it. It's really over? Burke's part is over.
The rest?
Maria shrugged. That remains to be seen. My people are still here, still on land that white settlers want. There will be other Burkes, other fights. But last night proved something important. What's that? That we can stand together. That we're stronger united than divided. She met his eyes. You could have ridden away yesterday. Instead, you rode into danger for people you didn't know. Your friends followed you. That kind of courage changes things. Jack didn't feel particularly courageous. He felt tired and sore and grateful to be alive. I just did what Billy would have done. Your brother must have been a good man. The best. Jack finished the stew and set the bowl aside. What happens now? Now you rest. Tonight we feast to celebrate our victory. Tomorrow, you and your friends are free to go, with our gratitude and friendship. Maria stood and moved toward the door, then paused. Or you could stay. Not just tomorrow. Stay longer. We could use someone like you around here. Someone who sees us as people instead of obstacles or enemies. Jack studied her face, trying to read what she wasn't saying. There was an invitation in her words that went beyond simple friendship or alliance. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd like to get to know us better. Get to know me better. Maria smiled, and it transformed her serious face into something radiant. I picked you to save yesterday. Maybe I'd like to pick you for other things too. Before Jack could respond, she slipped out the door, leaving him alone with his thoughts and a racing heart. He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 20 hours. Yesterday morning, he'd been a lonely cowboy working the small ranch and nursing a grudge against the man who'd killed his brother. Now Burke was under arrest. Jack had new friends and allies, and an Apache woman had just suggested she might be interested in him as more than just a temporary partner in a fight. It was too much to think about right now. His head hurt, his shoulder hurt, and he was still exhausted despite sleeping for hours. But underneath all that was something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. The future suddenly seemed full of possibilities instead of just obligations and sorrow. Maybe Billy's death hadn't been meaningless. Maybe this was the path Jack was supposed to be on, even though it was nothing like what he'd planned or expected. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him again, this time with Maria's smile floating through his dreams and the sound of celebration beginning to drift through the window from outside. The feast that night was unlike anything Jack had ever experienced. Long tables had been set up in the center of the village, laden with food from both Apache and cowboy traditions. Venison and rabbit roasted over open fires alongside beef and pork. Corn cakes and fry bread shared space with biscuits and beans. There was music, too, drums and flutes mixing with Pete's harmonica and Carlos's guitar. Children ran laughing between the tables while adults talked and shared stories in a mix of languages that somehow everyone understood. Jack sat beside Pete and his crew, all of them guests of honor at the celebration. Joseph made a speech thanking them for their courage and declaring them friends of the Apache people. The old women who'd tended Jack's wound presented each of the cowboys with intricately beaded leather bands to wear on their wrists, symbols of brotherhood and respect. Even Pete, who Jack had never seen emotional about anything, looked moved by the gesture. Maria sat across from Jack, and their eyes met frequently throughout the meal. Each time she smiled, and each time Jack felt his resolve to leave tomorrow weaken a little more. What was waiting for him back at his ranch? Empty rooms and memories of his dead brother. Here he'd found purpose, friendship, and the possibility of something more. Here he'd made a difference. Here he felt alive in a way he hadn't since Billy died. After the meal, people began dancing. Apache warriors showed the cowboys traditional dances, and in return, Pete taught them a ridiculous jig his grandfather had learned in Ireland. Everyone laughed as Danny tried and failed repeatedly to master the footwork, his gangly legs tangling worse with each attempt. The celebration went on for hours, and Jack found himself talking with people he'd feared just days ago, sharing jokes and stories like old friends. As the night grew late and the fires burned low, Maria found Jack sitting alone on the edge of the gathering. She settled beside him without speaking, and they watched the last of the dancers moving in the firelight. "You're thinking about leaving," she said finally. I have a ranch. Responsibilities. Even as he said it, the words felt hollow. You have an empty house and land that doesn't care if you're there or not. Maria turned to face him. I'm not asking you to give up your ranch. I'm asking you to consider dividing your time. Here for a while. Help us rebuild what Burke damaged. Get to know my people better. Get to know my people better. Maria, I'm just a cowboy.